I remember my younger self on a Sunday night football game when New England was undefeated, thinking like the world doesn't know we're going to beat New England tonight, and then we lost 56 to 10. So I am soaking it all up right now.
Mayo experience.
Mayo experience. Mayo experience. Mayo experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, presented by Underdog Fantasy. Code Mayo at Underdog Fantasy right now will get you a deposit bonus of up to $250. Continuing almost near the end of our NFL division previews, AFC East today. If you're looking for the other divisions, hit Mayo Media on YouTube, the Pat Mayo Experience audio podcast, or a treat just for you good people for tuning in. Hit the description. All the direct links are down there if you want to get caught up on what's going on with win totals, coaching changes, player-by-player recaps, division odds. We got it all covered for you. Mike Leone from EstablishTheRun.com is on the line with me right now. It has been too long, Mike, and whenever I talk about the AFC East, I generally talk to you about it.
Yeah, it has been too long, so I appreciate you reaching out to me, and glad that we get to do a show together.
Well, let's start off with the first team. According to the odds, a co-favorite to win the AFC East this year. Not your mighty Buffalo Bills, but the Aaron Rodgers-led New York Jets are plus 180 to win the AFC East this year. In terms of the win total, it's 9.5, and that's juiced up to minus 150. So for people who don't know, that means you need to bet $150 to win 100 on the New York Jets to win the AFC East this year. How much of this is real, Mike, and how much of this is people just buying into the hype of Aaron Rodgers and the New York Jets?
I do think it's pretty real. I think it was like Mike Clay of ESPN had the Jets with the best roster in the NFL. Something that I'm sure Tim is taking right in stride and not overreacting to whatsoever. But they're a really talented team. Brandon Thorne at Establish the Run has their offensive line ranked ninth. We saw how good the defense was last year, that they would be competitive in some games despite the worst quarterback play pretty much imaginable. And then you've got some legit skill players in Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson. So I think they're pretty real. I think the Bills, call me a homer, should still be the favorites here, but it's pretty tight.
So just trying to assess them as a team before we jump into fantasy. If there's anything that your research has proven, I mean, I've witnessed it year over year, maintaining an elite defense is really tough year over year just because of turnover luck, personnel luck, people figuring it out, getting more game tape, and a lot of, this is just anecdotal. I don't actually have any stats behind this. Maybe you do. Is that because the quarterback play was so putrid with the Jets last year, it doesn't feel like teams were really throwing their A-plus offensive game at the Jets, knowing they didn't have to.
I think there's a little something to that. If you look at things like pass rate over expectation, I'm trying to see what I had for the Jets last year. The pass rate over expectation for opposing offenses against the Jets was minus 6% last year, the lowest in the league. So teams certainly played a more conservative style, just understanding the opponent. So your anecdote is backed up by data here, Mayo.
See, just sometimes you see what you want to see, and sometimes the stats actually lead you to believe that that is actually true. I just remember it very vividly. It has nothing to do with last year. There was a Monday Night Football game. It was Baker on the road at the Jets. I think it was against Zach Wilson, like one of the first Zach Wilson games. And it was like 4th and 2 or something like that from like the 39-yard line. And the Browns were like, well, we have like a 10-point lead here. Or it may have even been like a 7-point lead. They're like, they can't literally move the ball. They can only move it backwards. They can't move it forwards. We are going to punt in this circumstance. Like, just bury them. Let them start on their own 20. They're not getting to our side of the field. And it was proven correct because the Jets just couldn't move the ball. So I do think that sometimes teams with really bad offenses might show a really good defense. And that's not to take away that the Jets have a really good defense. They do have a really good defense. But I do think it may have been propped up a little bit by how inept their offense was.
Yeah, it does shade the data a little bit. And to your point that you were making before that, the stickiness of a team's offense year over year is a little bit more present than the defense year over year. There's just a bit more volatility, a bit less control over being a really good defense than there is a really good offense. And a lot of that is just because of quarterback play and the teams you play against. Like, if you have a great quarterback, your offense is going to be really good year over year. But defensively, there's a little bit more variance, especially in terms of health. So still think the Jets will be pretty good, but I think the market might be a touch hot on them right now.
Well, Cust has proclaimed the Jets are going 14-3, and I assume that only gets bigger as we get closer to the season.
Yeah, Cust is he's out there. I'll have to book some sort of bet with him with the odds being similar right now.
I mean, he'll probably take it with Paul as well if Paul wants to get into the Bills versus Jets market. So I guess it kind of comes down to what you just said. If teams have an elite quarterback, the year-over-year stickiness of an offense can really go up. I guess the main question I have to you, which is I'm struggling with the most when trying to evaluate the Jets, is do they have an elite quarterback?
Yeah, that's where I think I'm a little bit lower than the market. I just think there's a little bit more risk here than the market is seeing. Rodgers is now, what, 40 years old, did not play last year with the exception of the one play. And the year before that in Green Bay, he really had fallen off quite a bit. Just had a 6.8 yards per attempt, 26 passing touchdowns. Those were kind of low numbers for him. So that's scary to me. And with Rodgers, there's always a little bit of like just strangeness around him in general too that I think brings into play some undefinable risk here. So that's where I'm a little bit concerned from both a real life perspective, but also from a fantasy perspective. This is where I like Garrett Wilson a lot, but I might, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole before we get into fantasy stuff. But there's some reasons why I'm not as high on him, maybe as some other analysts.
Well, let's jump into that because I do think that there's a very clear line here that people are drafting Garrett Wilson, people are drafting Breece Hall. So we can look at the underdog ADP, Mike, but I do think it's helpful to look at the season-long ADP as well because wide receivers are, I don't want to say artificially boosted in best ball on underdog. It's just that's the proper strategy to go with, just like drafting quarterbacks highly. That is not exactly what we're seeing in season-long formats. People aren't quad stacking a team in their season-long league, so it's depressing some of the value of these wide receivers and enhancing some of the value of the running backs. For example, Breece Hall is going number 5 overall in season-long drafts, be it through CBS or Yahoo or ESPN, whatever it is, that type of league. And then you have Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson is being drafted as, where are you at? Number 14 overall, wide receiver number 8. Does wide receiver 8, pick number 14, feel better for Garrett Wilson than where he's going in underdog, which is probably top 10?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit better. I think where he goes on underdog is right. I just wouldn't push him ahead of AJ Brown and Puka Nacua. I guess is where I draw the line. I do think he's the wide receiver 8. So I would take him after AJ Brown and Puka Nacua. I would take him before Drake London, Marvin Harrison, Chris Olave. The great stuff for Garrett Wilson is he's been pretty successful with some really, really bad quarterback play. And you can see where you have to just assume his efficiency is going to improve, which we have in our established run projections. Like we have his catch rate 6 points higher, his yards per reception a point higher, his TD rate a lot higher than it's been the past 2 years. Garrett Wilson was one of the best players in ESPN's open score last year. So really positive signs for him. The biggest concern for me is a little bit of that risk with how good Rodgers is. And even if Rodgers is good, this team might not have as much volume throwing the ball as some of these other teams. We noted they do have a very good defense. Rodgers teams historically are about like neutral in terms of pass rate, but they're very slow paced. They don't run up tempo. They're slow to snap the ball in terms of play clock at the time of snap. So there's some things that are depressing things here. What you're hoping if you take Wilson is you get a Devontae Adams type target share and you get that red zone usage that Rodgers has really propped up some of these receivers in the red zone, which is something that just really doesn't happen for a ton of wide receivers across the NFL.
I guess my pushback on Garrett Wilson, like you said, you would rather draft Puka Nacua and A.J. Brown over him. I think I would put Wilson ahead of those guys just because there is a chance that he is the alpha number 1 in New York with a good Rodgers, and all of a sudden that just leads to, I don't want to say a historic season, but the best season Garrett Wilson is probably going to have. At least I know with A.J. Brown, his stats are going to be good. The floor is probably better. And obviously we saw last year in that run that he had that he can be the wide receiver 1 overall for an extended period of time. But they do also have Jalen Hurts. They bring in Saquon Barkley. There are other options around that they can use. And with Nakua, I don't know how much the Cooper Kupp is going to impact him. Is Cooper Kupp going to get back to levels not quite where he was at when he was the number one receiver in fantasy? But like, I've thrown this question out a few times, and I want to get your take on it. What is the percent chance Cooper Kupp outscores Puka Nakua this year? 35?
I was going to say like 35 is probably fair. But I think those odds, that they might sound high, but I think if you did that for like any wide receiver with an end around 1 ADP to one with an early round 3 ADP would be a similar dynamic.
Okay.
It's so higher than you would think.
What do you think? No, absolutely. That's not necessarily the point of this, but like what percentage would you give Devonta Smith of outscoring AJ Brown?
It'd be higher than the Puka one, but I'm very high on Devonta Smith and the Eagles offense in general. I think their tempo is going to be awesome. Like they already run a ton of plays per game. Kellen Moore's offenses are always up tempo, but I think last year the offense got stale. They got a little figured out over the second half. I think they're going to move the receivers around a lot more this year. And I'm just, I don't know. I'm really bullish on the Eagles in general. So I'm a little bearish on Saquon at his cost. So I think the passing game, there's opportunities there. So it's pretty close with Garrett, AJ Brown, and Puka. But I think AJ Brown, you mentioned that stretch he had last year, 6 straight games with 125 or more yards. Like, I just think there's still an insane ceiling there. And then Puka, I'm just trying not to overthink. Like, this guy had, obviously the situation was great, but he had the best rookie wide receiver season ever. And he's entering year 2. Like, I don't want to overthink that. I really want to bet on that type of season.
Yeah, as someone who was very highly invested in Puka a year ago, I'm with you. I want Puka to be the best receiver in football. One thing that scares me about Puka is every time he makes a catch that's not completely in stride, it looks like he gets hurt. He doesn't, but it looks like it.
Yeah, he's been involved in some collisions that don't look great. Because he's got a motor, he runs super hard, but what's cool if you look at Puka though, I feel like there's a tendency, if you haven't watched him a lot, to think that it's a lot of like short stuff from Matthew Stafford, and Stafford is who Levitan has labeled as the wide receiver kingmaker because of all the wide receiver success that's come along with him. But man, Puka can go up and get a ball. You know, he's made some plays down the field, and his yak stuff is really good too. So I think that it's unfair to call him, I guess, a product of his environment. Not that people are doing that much, but I think he's like very, very good.
So we talked about Kupp versus Puka, that percentage. Devonta Smith versus AJ Brown, that percentage. What would be the percentage of any other New York Jet wide receiver outscoring Garrett Wilson?
Ooh, it's low, but it's very low. I think it would take injury.
It would take
an
injury or Mike Williams becoming the guy that you just talked about, that he is the Devontae Adams in the red zone for Aaron Rodgers and not Garrett Wilson, which I don't see happening.
I'm usually like pretty grounded. I'd put it at near 0% without injury that another receiver on the Jets. So, but the reason I'm still have Garrett behind though would just come to like team volume and stuff, where there's circumstances where Devonta Smith outscores AJ Brown, but AJ Brown still has like a great, a very good season. In those odds that you're mentioning, the concern with Garrett Wilson is just that, the team pass volume we look at comes down, or Rodgers is just kind of dust, and the efficiency and the volume aren't there. Either of them aren't there. So those are more the concerns than it is somebody else emerging and taking targets and being a target competitor away from Garrett Wilson.
See, I think I would gamble on, even with a lesser volume overall, that the target share would just be so much higher comparatively to the rest of his teammates, that when I'm trying to and all these guys are so close, like if you have to nitpick between them, that if we were to make a bet of which one of those 3 guys finishes as wide receiver 1, if that was in the cards, my bet would be Garrett Wilson because of those factors, that there's just no one taking away. So it's all him all the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think these guys are close. I still have Wilson behind those 2, but I definitely understand that point of view. I do a projections podcast series division by division each offseason with Ben Gretsch, and he's got Garrett Wilson as like top 5 wide receiver this year for those reasons.
Yeah, like I think you can make a pretty compelling case that Garrett Wilson is a better fantasy receiver this season than Amon-Ra St. Brown. I don't know if I would go that far, but I think that there's an argument to be had just based purely on volume, and then you put the talent along with it.
Yeah, there are some team scoring expectations that favor like Philly and Detroit that I think do help make up for less concentration in terms of the volume.
Sure, I think just even saying that playing 14 of 17 games indoors for the Lions is a big X factor for them. We're knowing that. I mean, do we have to rate any of the Jets players with a higher degree of injury because they play on that terrible MetLife field?
I mean, that's something I haven't done or looked into. We do take into account, Vegas does the sports books have the average spread, or I'm sorry, not the average, but each week they already have, a predicted game total and spread for each game. So we look at the average team total, which, if these spreads are correct, and they're like, okay, it's early, so there's a lot of variance, but they're a decent approximation of what we should expect for a team over the course of the season. And that takes into account the outdoors, not the injury stuff, but the playing not in a dome, playing potentially in bad weather. And we weight the playoff weeks a little bit heavier too, where the weather could be more of an issue. And we do that, we get the Jets with a team total on average of 23.1, which is solid. It's above average. But you get Philly at 24.8, Detroit at 25.2 is two of the highest teams in the league.
So in season long, AJ Brown and Puka are going 9 and 10. Garrett Wilson is going 14. He's the decision you'd have to make with Garrett Wilson, it seems, if you're drafting from that slot. Now, if you wanted to have him, I guess you could theoretically go AJ Brown and maybe get Garrett Wilson on the wraparound in those sorts of leagues. But he is closer in a cluster of wide receivers in terms of ADP with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Devontae Adams.
Yeah, I think if you're at the turn, you're pretty happy to get Garrett Wilson in a full PPR league. Even half PPR. I've been looking more at the non-best ball ADP. We get some ADP from Fantasy Pros, which is a mixture of like some of the sites you mentioned, like CBS, ESPN, like all those sites. And they switched over to their redraft ADP recently, which you see on our rankings at Established Run. And I see so many opportunities though at wide receiver in the subsequent rounds that, we haven't talked about Breece Hall yet, but we have him ranked 8th overall in PPR leagues, but from like a roster building standpoint, I think you could get him into the top 4 players, just knowing that you can probably beat your league mates with really good wide receiver picks and avoiding bad running back picks in the next 5 to 6 rounds.
That's really interesting that in terms of season long, and I've been trying to talk about this for a while. I just spoke to Sealy about it, is that everyone who plays underdog and plays best ball also plays season long. But the inverse is nowhere close to true. So the strategy is just so much different. And a lot of people people like to talk about it like, oh yeah, everyone's just doing this now because this is happening in best ball. That is not the case when you show up to draft your home league. It's not happening.
No, I'm sure this will change a little bit, but that ADP looking at full PPR leagues has Malik Neighbors, for example, 52 overall. On underdog, he's an early, 3rd round pick. He's going 27th. So that's a huge. So there's 2 discrepancies. One, the wide receivers are go a lot later in the home league ADP, but even within the wide receiver, there's a lot more variance in terms of the types of wide receivers that are preferred on underdog versus the types that are preferred in home league. So you sort of get a double whammy there where you can get some really good values because the receivers go later, and then even within the receivers, in our opinion, the wrong receivers go ahead of some of the better receivers.
Breece Hall is being drafted as running back 2, pick number 5 overall. Essentially, with pick number 5 in redraft leagues, you have a choice if you want to draft a running back between him and Bijan. Which one would you take?
I would take Bijan, but I mean, it's hard to go wrong with either of these guys. These are the exact types of running backs you want. Young running backs in the peak of their career. I think they're pretty both relatively safe in the, I mentioned some systemic risks with the Jets offense, but I don't see them completely bottoming out. And we even saw last year they bottomed out, and Breece Hall was fine because he's that good and he's such a clear workhorse. I favor Bijan a little bit. I think there's a bit more juice in the Atlanta offense overall, the types of games that they might play, and the dome outdoor stuff. Also, his usage in the pass game, I think, could be a little bit better than Breece's, but we're splitting hairs. I mean, both these guys are phenomenal picks.
Worth noting too, if you want to make your own projections and customize them completely free, go to runthesims.com right now to sign up with an email, jump into the season-long projections, and you can modify them and save them any way you want and print off your own rankings. Or one of the nice exercises that I like to do that helps me find some value, Mike, I'm sure that you've done this in your projection series as well, is what happens if Breece Hall gets hurt day one? What does the rest of the Jets roster look like? And who stands to benefit the most from that? I don't want to go through that because I don't want to see Breece Hall get hurt again. But those are some of the things that you can do very easily at runthesims.com with that projection system. So go check that out now if you haven't done that. Outside of Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, both top 20 picks at worst, who else on the Jets is worth drafting?
Well, I mean, the scenario that you don't want to entertain, but I think, at the end of your drafts for a bench spot, if you've got like 8 to 10 bench spots, I know a lot of home leagues might only have like 6, and that's different. But once you get past like 6 bench spots, but Braylon Allen, I think, seems like he's emerging as the clear running back 2 here early in camp, and just betting on rookies that people are uncertain of is a good bet. It's a pure handcuff play, 100%. But those are the types of plays you want to make because they're so easy to drop. If Breece Hall is fine and makes it through the season, you need to churn the waiver wire for someone else, you can do so. That's in play. Other than that, in best ball, I've taken some Mike Williams just because I think the market has been overly fearful. I know he's coming back from this ACL injury, but it sounds pretty clean. He should be back for the start of the season. Even if they bring him along slowly, I think in best ball where he goes right now, there's some potential for him to put up good efficiency numbers with Rodgers playing the downfield role and having some decent touchdown upside. He goes 133, which is wide receiver 61 on Underdog. Less interest in him in a redraft league where I'd probably be looking at some of the rookie wide receivers and just betting on pure ceiling at that point. But in best ball, I like him.
Do you like Ty Conklin at all as a redraft tight end, or is that just there's no upside with any of these guys?
I think I don't really like him in I would want to come out of my redraft league with a better tight end than Ty Conklin. Best ball, they're stacking stuff and you take multiple tight ends to fill those scores. It's a totally different game. But for redraft, I think you're pretty disappointed if you're coming out with Ty Conklin as your starter. I think in most redraft leagues, I really would like to get a top 13, top 12-ish tight end. I just think there's a pretty big drop off, and the late round tight ends this year don't inspire me in terms of my confidence in them having any sort of ceiling.
Yeah, well, you're drafting based on like what your priors are going in. It's not that there's guys outside of the top 12 that probably won't be inside the top 10. There'll probably be 2 or 3 of them. It's just trying to figure out who that is damn near impossible.
Yeah, we had not even just hindsight focus, but even process wise, there were guys like Trey McBride, Sam Laporta last year, the Dallas guys going late that you could make better bets and better cases on in terms of late round tight ends. There's a couple that I like, but it's hard to see like a real big ceiling outbreak on some of them. So, and I think the top tight ends are at pretty good prices that you can get one without sacrificing. There's not a ton of opportunity cost, I guess, in getting one, especially in these home leagues. I'm like more willing to reach on an elite player at a onesie position, just thinking that I can beat people through depth and roster management, that I really want to lock in an advantage at the onesie position where I can't like manage that. There's not going to be values late, not as many values late that break out in a big way. So like lock me in that advantage and then let me hopefully run a bit pure on some of the wide receivers that I'm taking, running backs I'm taking later in the draft.
Are you a Malachi Corley guy? Because Cust is.
Is he? I'm a little bit of a Malachi Corley guy. I know Anthony Amico, who does our prospect stuff at Established to Run, is much higher than the market on Malachi Corley that was shown in our dynasty ranks. I do have a decent bit of him in best ball. My thing with prospects is I'm mostly just listening to people who know better than me. I'm not trying to prospect myself. And it seems like a mixed bag on Corley. I know from training camp early on, it sounds like his route running's a little bit of an issue. The good thing with Corley, if you're making a bull case for him, it's that he should have an opportunity to emerge. Alan Lazard is straight dust. Xavier Gibson, I think, is more of a return specialist, so he might start ahead of Corley, but the target earning potential there is pretty low. And then you have Mike Williams, who I mentioned I'd like, but we can also acknowledge that he's aging and coming back from injury, and there's some risk there. So there could, Corley could get some opportunity here in like this slot short ADOT type role that could, Randall Cobb-esque type playing with Rodgers. So there's some upside here, but I'm not, you know, in most home leagues, he's probably going undrafted and probably should.
One of the big pushbacks I get when I'm not the most bullish on the Jets possible is that, well, even if Rodgers isn't as good as Aaron Rodgers MVP used to be, that he's still going to be 5,000,000% better than anything that the Jets ran at quarterback last year, which I agree with. But even if you get, I don't know, 60% Rodgers from what we saw last time, not even peak Rodgers, what we saw last time 2 years ago in Green Bay, is that enough to like lift them to be an elite team?
I don't think that's enough. And that's where I think I probably agree with you a little bit, being somewhat, I mean, I hate to even say bearish, but just not as bullish as the market, is that anytime you get mediocre quarterback play, like the team's going to be at risk. We mentioned the variance in how good the defense is. I expect them to be a good defense, but if they take a step back there, and you're also pretty concentrated on the skill players, he's got very good skill players, elite skill players in Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, but he doesn't have a lot behind that. And that's where, if Malachi Corley breaks out and Mike Williams ends up fully healthy, things could look a lot better. But I do think there's some risk here in the combination of depth in the offensive skill players and how good is Rodgers. And I hear exactly what you're saying all the time too, is like, yeah, they were throwing out Tim Boyle. Like, who cares if Rodgers is only okay? But anytime you don't have a top 10 producing quarterback, there's going to be risk, even if your roster is very good. And it's not like a San Francisco situation where they have an absurd amount of good skill players, very good defense, and an amazing offensive coach in Shanahan. I have some concerns over the Jets coaching staff. I don't think they're, top 10 in the league there either. So mediocre quarterback, mediocre coaching staff, things could definitely go wrong.
Passion, drive, patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Supercharger, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. Everyone who tunes into the Pat Mayo Experience knows from time to time I like to talk to you about some health supplements that I end up taking, and I've been doing Timeline's MitoPure now for about a month. Feel great? And I think you can too. Take 2 soft gels a day for 2 months, and you can see significant improvements in your cellular energy, your muscle strength, and your endurance. That was the big thing. I've been golfing more this summer and lifting less. Yet when I go back to the gym for my once a week, like max lift, I am not really atrophying that much. I'm not losing a ton of muscle, which is absolutely fantastic news for me and my golf game, because if you work out too much, then you get too sore, you get too stiff, you need to retain that flexibility. I'm retaining my muscle mass at the same time, although I'm not working out as much, and it comes in 2 product designs to fit your needs. They're berry powder, which is great to mix into your breakfast, yogurt, or daily smoothie. That's how I've been doing it. I've been eating some strawberries, raspberries, blackberries with a little bit of yogurt, a little bit of protein powder, then boom, Timeline's MitoPure right on top of that. Or they have soft gels for the days where you're just on the run and wanted something convenient to grab and go. So, Timeline is offering 10% off your first order of MitoPure right now. So go to timeline.com/Mayo to get that 10% off. All right? Let's move to your Buffalo Bills, who have a full win higher in the win total column than the New York Jets. They are 10.5. However, You get plus money for betting them to hit the over 11 or more wins. It's plus 130 right now, meaning to bet $100, you would win 130 on the bring back, but they have the exact same odds to win the division plus 180 as the New York Jets do right now. Outside of Josh Allen and Josh Allen and James Cook, how do you draft the receivers on the Bills? I like Keon Coleman. I assume you now like him because he's on the Bills, but going into the season, you probably hated his guts.
Yeah, absolutely. Did a pre-draft show, and they kind of asked me the receiver. I didn't really want the Bills to take it at 28, and I was like, I don't really want them to take Keon Coleman. But I was a little happier that they traded down twice and then grabbed him, where they got some value out of it. And at the point where he went, I thought he made sense. I did want them to take Xavier Worthy. It's a little painful to see him go to Mahomes and the Chiefs and have to live seeing what he could potentially do there. But I'm pretty bullish on Keon Coleman. I feel like there's been some FUD on Keon Coleman relative to some of the other rookie wide receivers. I know during minicamp, Brandon Beane and the coaching staff had some comments about him being a rookie and coming along slowly and all these things. But out of actual training camp, it's been rave reviews. He's been running with the ones. It sounds like it's going really well. And there's obviously a ton of potential here. With Stephon Diggs out, they bring in Keon Coleman. That's the only wide receiver they draft. They did make a move in free agency, bringing in Curtis Samuel as well. But he's definitely the receiver here that should go first of the bunch. He does go first of the bunch in drafts. But in terms of profit potential, I don't see a whole big reason to have him way behind like Lad McConkey, for example, who in some leagues is going like a full round earlier than Keon Coleman.
Like, I don't have any particular interest in Curtis Samuel as a fantasy player. Like, he'll be good 3 weeks throughout the course of the year. Maybe, take his higher on underdog for single game receptions a few times. And hopefully that works out depending on the opponent. And then you have Khalil Shakir, who we've seen a lot of Shakir over the past 2 years at least. People are talking about him like he's going to step into the Diggs role. Like, he's good. He's not that good.
Yeah, I'm bearish on Shakir. I wanted to be in on Shakir. If you look at his per target stuff, it's really good yards per target. He had a stretch last year where he caught like X amount of targets in a row, and it was pretty insane. And he's been a really solid player for the Bills. I just don't think he's the type of player they view having this really big expanded role. I think he is who he is, and he's good at what he does, and that's where he's going to stick. I don't see him taking on a whole bunch of the Diggs targets. I have concerns with them having two tight ends that they want to get on the field at the same time. Like, does that push Shakir off the field if it's going to be Curtis Samuel, Keon Coleman, Dawson Knox, and Dalton Kincaid out there? I have concerns that they might want to mix around with Keon Coleman in the slot at times, which potentially puts like Mac Hollins on the outside, and Shakir could get lost there. So I don't see a big ceiling here for Shakir. I think he's a good player, probably a better real life player than a fantasy player.
I love all of the random jabronis the Bills have at receiver after these three guys. It's like a real who's who of guys that at one point or another you were probably in on over the past 5 years and just it did not work out. Mac Hollins, Chase Claypool, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, KJ Hamler's in that mix. Andy Isabella. Could you imagine? I mean, he was on the team last year, but could you imagine if Andy Isabella was good? Your head would explode.
I tried to convince our Slack last year when Isabella got called up for a game that we should all bet his anytime touchdown prop, and I don't think he played a snap the entire game. So, I'm still clinging to some of these guys, but I don't think any of these guys are really going to make an impact. It sounded early on like MVS was a lock to make the roster, but now that sounds a little shakier. They have this guy, Shavers, who's been playing really well. That's the thing. You get name recognition with a guy like Claypool, but you don't realize like his odds of even making the team are really pretty low. MVS's are definitely higher, but I think, you're talking like a field stretcher role. I don't think he would get a ton of targets. And it seems like Mac Hollins might be that dude that just plays more than people want in the fantasy community.
He does it everywhere he goes. He plays more. And do you know why? Because he's I'm not going to make it an accusation. I'll say it as a joke, but he's very clearly on steroids if you look at him. He is jacked.
He's jacked. He's also a little out there. He's a one of those barefoot guys, which I respect. I'm a minimalist shoe guy, so appreciate that. But he's an out there dude. But I do think they like him. Like he can stretch the field a little bit, and he's a really good run blocker, which I think gets him on the field. And it's just going to be annoying. Like I don't think any of these guys is going to in redraft. Like these guys are untouchable beyond Coleman, Samuel, and Shakir. I think Shakir is still draftable, even with my upside concerns, but probably overdrafted in most of these. But yeah, you're really not touching any of these. If Claypool made the roster, I'd get interested because he's the one dude where you could see if things broke like 99.99th percentile, he actually has a ceiling, but he would have to make the team first. And even then, you'd want to see him actually cracking the rotation on game day.
Dalton Kincaid is being drafted as the 5th wide receiver off the board in redraft, 51st overall. I get it, but there's no chance I'm paying that price for Dalton Kincaid.
I do like Kincaid. I
Sure you
think
do.
this was a very good rookie season that maybe gets overshadowed because Sam Laporta's season was so good. His A dot over the second half of the season under Joe Brady improved quite a bit. So I think his efficiency was maybe a little bit better than was let on. There's some concerns that, when Knox got hurt for part of last year, when Knox came back, the route rate, though, for Kincaid stayed pretty high, like 75% ish. Obviously, if you're taking him TE5, you want that to be higher, but I think it's like a small miss, big hit type of player where worst case scenario, there's a ton of targets available in Josh Allen offense, even at a 75% route share. He has a pretty high floor, especially in like a full PPR league or tight end premium league. Best case scenario, though, is we get a legitimate breakout. And sometimes these tight ends, the efficiency will follow after earning some volume. We saw that with McBride a little bit, where he was super inefficient with Arizona at the end of year one, and then he got the breakout year two. So I'm pretty bullish on this type of player. So I like Kincaid, maybe better than any of the receiving options at cost. But yeah, take your shot at the younger players here on this offense. Those are the guys that we could be talking about next year being drafted way higher. Whereas if you hit on Curtis Samuel, like I don't know if his draft status is going to change much this year to next. Like it's not going to be a massive hit.
Let's have the James Cook conversation right now. Being drafted as running back number 15 in redraft, 40th overall. My projections at Run the Sims have him as running back number 6 for the year.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it's not like I artificially boosted him up in any sort of way. It's just maybe I have his touchdowns higher than people think because Josh Allen's going to steal all the touchdowns, which has really been one of my cases over the past few years of why you should just never draft a Bills running back. But underneath Joe Brady at the end of last year, it just seemed like this is the route they wanted to go to keep Josh Allen healthy. Get him to stop running so much and give James Cook the ball. Because Josh Allen, when he drops back to pass, always has the option to run. When he hands it off, he can't do that anymore.
Yeah, I disagree with you there a little bit. I think Allen was running a decent bit under Brady the second half of the season. He ended up with 15 rushing touchdowns. And I also think under Brady, it reminds me a little bit. There was the year before the Eagles kind of broke out passing in a big way. They had this crazy run heavy offense. And it was sort of this thing like they needed to do, and it was working, and they stuck with it. The Bills at the end of the last season reminded me that a little bit. They got in some of these games and the run was working, and they had games last season that they never had before. This is a team that's always positive pass rate over expectation. Last second half of the season, they had games of -9% PROE, -8%, and 2 games at -16% back to back. Those were both in the fantasy playoffs. This would sound like I'm saying they're going to be very run heavy this year, but I think it was a little bit fluky. I don't know what to expect for them this year. I think that's one of the interesting points about the Bills for fantasy is I think that pass rate has a very wide range. I talked about with Gretsch when we did our off seasons podcast. We both have them right around league average, around 60% pass rate, but I don't see those James Cook bell cow games and where he goes in drafts. I think positionally is okay, but that's where in home leagues the running backs really start to get inflated versus some of these wide receiver options. So I'm not as interested. If there's meat on the bone for Cook, though, it's that I think there's still more big plays in him than we've seen so far. He dropped 4 touchdowns last year, which is kind of insane to even be in that position. He gets downfield looks in the passing game, and he's an efficient, explosive player. But I do expect Ty Johnson and Ray Davis to play a decent role here as well in the Bills' backfield.
So when I say conservative, maybe this isn't conservative at all, but I have the Bills at a 45% rushing rate, not a 40% like it sounds like you have, and I have James Cook with 45% of the rushing attempts this year between him, Josh Allen, Davis, and Ty Johnson. Throw in one for Frank Gore Jr., whatever it might be, but 45% doesn't seem unachievable for him.
No, I think that's a reasonable number. We're at 42%, so we're not too far off. We're a little bit lower. The team rush rate, we could be off depending on how we're defining that. Like I'm doing called pass plays. So I don't know if you have scrambles, if you're including that as a run.
I am including that as a run in mine.
So we're actually probably not too far off then, because I'm including it as a pass play, a called pass play. So our 40% run rate is not including the scrambles. So once you adjust for the scrambles, we're probably not too far off, but it might just be an efficiency touchdown thing. Cook historically has been a pretty low TD rate player. A lot of that's because they haven't used him by the goal line, whether they've used other backs or they've used Josh Allen. He's had a tough time getting there. And that's probably, I would guess, is our biggest discrepancy. We have him with about 4.5 to 5 rushing touchdowns.
Yeah, I have him at 9 total touchdowns. So that is absolutely the difference. I guess I just feel like the price for him right now, like would I draft him as the number 6 running back off the board? Probably not. But where I'm seeing him go as running back 15, in that Josh Jacobs range, Joe Mixon. When I take a look at those guys, yeah, like we're already pricing in the volume that comes along with those guys. Even if I'm wrong about the volume and the touchdowns for James Cook, then he is going to be running back number 15. If I'm right and he does see an uptick, he has a chance to be one of these top 5 guys out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit more skeptical that he's got a top 5 ceiling, but I am with you in terms, like positionally, like I said, I think he's fine. It's more, I'd rather have gotten my running back at that point. The Fantasy Pros ADP has him going 34th overall. So at that point, there's most of the elite tight ends are on the board. Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs, those types of players are on the board. And that's where, going back to the Breece Hall thing, like I'd be willing to take Breece Hall earlier than Jamar Chase, just knowing how the draft output. So it's more of a roster construction thing for me. We recorded a Dead Zone podcast on Established Run the other day. And for those unfamiliar, the running backs in rounds 3 through 6 have been labeled kind of the dead zone the last handful of years, and it's slowly the prices are getting a little bit better, but it's backs that a lot of times get this projectable volume, aren't necessarily that talented on a shaky offense that could fail. So I don't think he's a dead zone back. So
the player you're describing right now, the dead zone running back, just off the top of my head, based on price, profile, and the offense, is Rachaad White.
Yeah, so you are right, but I actually like Rachaad White. The one thing he's got going for him, though, is that I'm just constantly a Baker bull, and he finally did okay. So I think the offense could be okay, but the pass game role for him is really good. That's another element of the dead zoning backs. So they're like 2 down backs, and I think that can keep him on the field and prop him up in PPR. But other than that, you're right. He does fit that definition. The one that I think most fits the definition is Zamir White, who I think is like one of the worst picks. I mean, that's a 2 down back who we're giving a ton of volume to just because he had 4 good games on the stretch last year, doesn't have much of a pedigree. The team could be pretty bad. But all this to say, James Cook is not a dead zone back, because what do we get out of him? He does contribute in the passing game. He is on a good offense. We do expect him to be efficient. Our concerns are workload. And to your point, if we're wrong on the workload, then it's probably only going to get better for him. It's not going to get worse. So I think he's fine. I just think running back in general is a tough sell where he goes in redraft leagues.
Josh Allen's being drafted as the number 1 quarterback. Is he the number 1 quarterback, or is there actually a gap between him and other players, or is it like 5 quarterbacks could be number 1, and then you don't need to take him first?
I think him and Jalen Hurts are neck and neck and pretty clearly in a tier of their own as top fantasy quarterbacks. I'm not buying into any of the tush-push stuff going away for Philly. I think both these guys have rushing touchdown upside that maybe only Anthony Richardson can match. And that's sort of what keeps them ahead of Lamar Jackson, where he's a little bit smaller bodied than Allen and Hurts. So by the goal line, we saw it last year, they just turned and handed off to Gus Edwards for easy touchdowns. That's not going to change with Derrick Henry back there. So that keeps Lamar behind Allen and Hurts. And yeah, I think their combination of guys that can get it done in the air and on the ground is just, it's tough to beat. And in today's NFL for fantasy, some of the quarterbacks we used to like 5 to 7 years ago, like I think Tyrod Taylor when he was with Buffalo, those guys aren't that good anymore. Like you need to do more than just run. Like you got to throw too. And I think these two with their hybrid approach are clearly the best two fantasy quarterbacks.
I haven't got your take on this at all, but like I drafted a ton of Anthony Richardson last year, and that was fine for like 2 games, and then it wasn't so great anymore. I'm just going to end up with Jaden Daniels in basically every redraft league, and if it doesn't work out, I'll pick up Matt Stafford.
Yeah, I think Jaden Daniels is, I'm looking at our redraft rankings. We have him QB 10. He's QB 12 in ADP. And I definitely see that. I think that's a very smart pick.
I don't see a scenario where he finishes as running back 10, 11, or 12. He's either going to be quarterback 3 or quarterback like 30. Like he's either going to be good or not good for fantasy purposes, it feels like.
I think the middle point is that he runs so much that even if he's bad in real life, he could be fine in fantasy. And then if he's actually good in real life, he could be really, really good for fantasy. So I'm with you on Jaden Daniels. I do like him quite a bit, especially in home league stuff. I think he fits really well. Like we're a little bit less worried about stacking and stuff like we are in best ball. I think he's also going to go a little bit later in home leagues than he does in best ball. And then it also gives you the opportunity to really grab that elite tight end early, wait a little bit on a guy like Jaden Daniels. I mean, around pick 100, I'm with you. I like that route. And I mentioned Allen and Hurts as the clear QB1s, but when they go in the 20s, I'm still not drafting them. That's too early.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
And they're going to go there.
They are. Yeah. And listen, I've always kind of said this. I mean, I really haven't done that much season-long fantasy football coverage so far this year. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years now. So it gets to the point where I don't want to feel like I'm repeating myself year over year. But if you're just someone who's randomly tuning in, which I doubt you are, and making it to minute 44 of this random AFC East preview show for fantasy football, if you're someone who like doesn't really want to pay attention to what's going on and like you're just, this is the only thing that you've watched, here's a piece of advice. Just draft a good quarterback because then you never have to worry about it. I am going to pay attention. You're going to pay attention. Therefore, we don't need to spend that sort of draft capital on a guy who's relatively safe at the position.
Yeah, and Kyler Murray's another guy too that I think in home leagues fits that mold of like not going too early so the opportunity cost isn't as big, but has a bit more upside than I think people are probably giving him credit for, especially with them drafting Marvin Harrison.
I'm the opposite of that. I don't like Kyler at all.
I like Kyler. I think, year 2, coming back from the injury, Trey McBride broke out. Maybe he's, adds to that this year. Then you bring in Marvin Harrison. He runs enough. It's not Lamar running, but it's pretty solid rushing production. I like him a decent bit there. I'll stick with the rookies, though. I mean, Caleb Williams, too, has so much talent around him. He doesn't have that rushing upside that Jaden Daniels does, and Jaden Daniels should go in front of him because of that. But I think he's a very talented prospect, which is why he was the clear-cut number 1 overall pick. But the skill players around him, they've really done a much better job supporting him than they ever did with Fields when you've got DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, you draft Rome Odunze. It's pretty exciting.
I would agree. Right now, in redraft leagues, Williams is going ahead of Daniels, which is kind of crazy to think about. But they're kind of back-to-back just after that Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy tier. I guess my thing with Kyler Murray that worried me, and maybe it was because of the injury, is that he doesn't run as much as I think the people think that he does. And the rushing touchdowns are going to be weighed down because when Arizona did the tush push last year, and they were either the most or second most effective team of doing it because you just think Philadelphia, but Arizona ran it a ton too with Gannon going over there and really implementing that. They brought in their backup quarterback to run it, not Kyler Murray.
Yeah, they did do that. I'm, slightly concerned that could be something they do again to protect him, but I think we're factoring in that he's not going to have that rushing touchdown upside as some of these top guys. But I think the passing upside is, I agree with you that like the average person might think that he runs more than he does at this point. But I think the flip side is also true where the passing upside for him is probably higher than the average person thinks.
Miami is the third favorite. They're just behind the Jets and Buffalo. They're 2-1 to win the division. The Dolphins' win total this year is 9.5, the same as the Jets. They are boosted up to -135, so you have to lay $135 to win 100 on the Miami Dolphins. They just re-signed Tua. The deal's actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be for Miami, and they're kind of like, they're all in at this point with Tua. We'll see how that ends up going. But obviously Tyreek, he's coming off as a top 3 pick, as he probably should. He's either the first, second, or third wide receiver, wherever you look. Jalen Waddle's still a top 20 wide receiver right now. But then we get to the backfield. Like, listen, I watched Devin Achane too. I get that he's really good. Like, I think there's like maybe a 50% chance he is the number 1 running back on Miami in terms of fantasy points by the end of the year. Like he's not going to average 7 yards per carry. It's just not happening.
He's not, but I do think that when you get this type of player, it's someone you want to be in on and try not to overthink the volume, where we just so rarely get someone that bursts on the scene with this type of efficiency to that extreme level. Obviously, you're not expecting it to repeat, but where you're excited for Achane is if he is even split with Mostert. There's a lot of other factors, including the age, the injury history. The injury history is shaky for both of them. That's where I guess Achane's concern is a little bit small, got banged up last year, but Mostert's got an injury history as well, much older back, of course. I think Achane's utilization in the passing game was pretty solid too. We saw that down the stretch. So I'm still buying him. He's also one of the few backs, Pat, that if you compare best ball to these redraft ADPs, most of them get thrust up like quite high. Like the Kyron Williams, Derrick Henry types are going to go way earlier. Jonathan Taylor way earlier. Achane's the one that sort of stays flat, going from best ball to your home league redraft because people have those concerns over the workload that you mentioned and that you seem to have concerns over too. So I'm pretty in on Achane. I know it could look bad at the end of the season, but I think even in a timeshare, this offense is so efficient and he's so explosive that he'll be fine, compared to a lot of these backs. But there's that upside case that I think is truly there where he could really break things for fantasy.
If he ends up being the guy, then yes, he breaks fantasy and he has that like Tomlinson type season where you need to have him in order to win. And I think he makes more sense in best ball because you don't need his bad weeks. You need his good weeks. And his good weeks are going to be so high. But right now in season long, he's being drafted 19th overall, the 8th running back. He's still going ahead of Kyron Williams, Isaiah Pacheco, and Derrick Henry. I'd rather have those guys.
Kyron in a home league, maybe I'd rather take, but I don't know. I'm Achane, like you talk about Pacheco especially. I'm definitely Achane over Pacheco. I think it's a much better player. And again, it's just, I think, a rare opportunity. And we talked about Puka earlier too, where he had this absurd rookie season. Obviously, Achane didn't have the volume to back it up that Puka did, but these are the types of players that can truly win you fantasy. And I think when you zoom out and you look historically at like bust rates, like a lot of these players bust more than you would think. So you really don't want to be drafting for floor. You want to be drafting for ceiling. And yeah, that's my pitch for Achane.
I get the pitch, but the pitch is that he's Priest Holmes, and he's not Priest Holmes.
Yeah, he's better.
You think he's better than Priest Holmes?
I don't know. We'll find out.
He's not. He can have his best year. He won't be better than Priest Holmes.
I feel like we usually make a bet this time of year. I feel like an Achane bet is brewing. Achane bet.
Yeah. Well, what is the bet with him though?
Yeah, it has to be something progressive, right? Because I need to get paid off on the upside. If it's just straight median points, you're obviously right. You take some of these other guys over him on straight median points.
Yeah, we'll come up with something maybe off air. We'll recirculate back around to that. Outside of Waddle and Hill, anyone else in the receiving core? Because you have Take Me to the River. He's still around. Braxton Berrios is still around. Beckham is on this team now. Do you have any interest in these guys?
I mean, in basketball, sometimes you last round stack with Beckham or the rookie Malik Washington, who's got some speed, but in redraft, the only two you're taking are Waddle and Hill.
Oh, and they did sign my favorite $2,500 random punt tight end, Jonnu Smith.
I feel like he's a little bit over. I mean, I guess I don't. I just don't envision him playing a real role in redraft other than like an emergency starter on a week where you're in trouble. I think he'll have some weeks where he has a big play or two, but the volume I just really do not expect to be there in a way that it needs to be there to be an every week starter at the position.
Because Achane is being drafted so highly, people are just kind of passing on Mostert, who, if healthy, should be really good again.
Yeah, Mostert, this is the one I'm struggling with most because I think our ranks right now are too light on Mostert for this reason where, yes, I'd rather be in on Achane than Mostert, but that is really baked in by the market. You know, they're going 5 rounds apart, 4 to 5 rounds apart. And Mostert, I mean, this is something I don't know if we've ever seen in redraft leagues or in any leagues where the guy who leads the league in rushing touchdowns is going in like the 8th round. So I think of the bell curve, the small brain, big brain bell curve meme, and there's part of that makes me think like Mostert just runs for a bunch of touchdowns, like the low IQ, high IQ matchup, and like that's all you should think about and not worry about the middle of the bell curve, which is like, oh, he's older, he's got injury risk, Achane's gonna overtake him, all that stuff. So I'm pretty conflicted on Mostert, but it's hard to really argue against his cost right now.
The cost is great. The upside is there just purely based off those touchdowns. And even if you're wrong, it's now not really costing you anything.
Yeah, it's the cost is pretty cheap. So again, this is where I see our rank and our inputs and they make sense to me. But then when I see what it spits out relative to ADP, even though we're like slightly behind ADP on him, I cannot fault anyone for taking him at ADP. And he is someone that I end up reaching a little bit ahead of our rankings on in draft for that reason.
Yeah, like I have Achane projected for 7 more fantasy points than Raheem Mostert, and they're 50 picks apart.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be wider than that. I think
it will be.
Achane's going to have.
Yeah, like I mean, if Achane is good, it's going to be 100 points difference. But there's also the reverse case where Mostert just scores 16 touchdowns and he scores like 75 more points.
Right. Or they're just both really good. You know, I mean, we saw it with Gibbs and David Montgomery last year. They were both really good. We definitely could have a situation like that in Miami where they're both really good, but Mostert is quite a bit cheaper.
How do you feel about Tua as a fantasy quarterback? He's pretty, like, he's DFS only for me.
In redraft again, try not to get. I have a lot of best ball in the brain where you're taking more quarterbacks because of the best ball scoring.
Sure.
But yeah,
put it this way: you can just
would,
say that you can draft anyone in best ball and like you can make it work.
Yeah, that's actually very accurate. So in redraft, yeah, I think he's going to have some really big weeks on efficiency, but I think he's going to have some really ho-hum weeks where they don't run at a very fast pace. They're not super pass happy as much as you would think. And the weeks that the running backs really get it are going to be difficult for him. It's also not the greatest playoff schedule. So we've got him QB 15, his ADP's QB 13. You're doing the math on a 12-team league. You probably don't want to be outside the top 12 quarterbacks. So yeah, the other guys we mentioned have more upside, like Jaden Daniels, the rookies, Caleb Williams, etc.
New England. Does this make you happy? Like it makes Cust happy how they're not awesome anymore? Like you can't wipe the smile off of Tim's face when I tell him that the over-under for the Patriots is 4.5. Although people are betting the over on the 4.5 wins for the Patriots, and they are 25-1 to win the AFC East. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel quite good. As someone who had season tickets for the duration of the Buffalo Bills playoff drought, that is the year after they lost the Music City Miracle, all the way up to the year they made the playoffs with Tyrod Taylor and lost to the Jaguars in the wild card round. Had season tickets and saw a lot of New England games that were quite painful. I remember my younger self on a Sunday night football game when New England was undefeated, thinking like the world doesn't know we're going to beat New England tonight, and then we lost 56-10. So I am soaking it all up right now.
Are they actually this bad?
I think they're pretty bad.
Like, what if Drake May is
If you
good?
look, yeah, I mean that's the big thing when you draft a rookie quarterback, and if he ends up being very good, that can totally change things. We saw it with the Texans and CJ Stroud last year, but we also saw it with the Panthers. If the quarterback isn't good, it can be really bad. Brandon Thorne has their O line ranked 31st overall out of 32 teams. That's a really bad sign. As for a rookie quarterback, the schedule out of the gate is pretty tough for them. So I do think there's a chance we don't see May until maybe like midseason when they get through a lot of those really difficult games. So it's tough. There's some upside just because you've got not only the rookie quarterback, but you've got some rookie pass catchers, most notably Jalen Polk. And if he's also really good, you can start to see how things change in a hurry. You've got a new coach, and maybe that adds to some of the uncertainty here, but I don't see much of a ceiling. They might end up being okay, but I don't really see any way that they're good this year.
How many Patriots do you think get drafted in redraft leagues outside of the Boston area? When people, I have my one Patriots fan in my league who will most definitely be drafting Jalen Polk. Like, this guy's awesome. Like, who knows? But
I mean,
it's Ramondre. Is that it?
I was gonna say that's it. It's Ramondre, and I think he's probably a bad pick where he goes. Um, Talk about a dead zone back. I think they bring in Antonio Gibson, who's got a history as kind of a pass catching back. So if you take some of that off Ramondre's plate, and now he's, let's say a 2.5 down back on a bad team. Efficiency wasn't there last year. O line stinks. Yeah, there's other directions I'd rather go than Ramondre, and that's it.
If
You're not.
I like Kendrick Bourne as a real life player, and I do think that he has like DFS value, like in a weekly matchup, if he's okay coming off this knee injury. And like there were weeks where Demario Douglas was okay, Pop Douglas, but I don't know. KJ Osborne is there now. I was talking to like for best ball, and I think this is where some of these guys come into play. Like, is there a cheaper stack you could find than Drake May, Demario Douglas, and Jalen Polk?
Yeah, that's what's nice in best ball is you're drafting deeper at the positions, and if you get screwed on your correlation in your stacks early, you can be like, all right, I got New England. If I get Drake May, I've got like 4 options I can go to. If I miss on Polk, I've got Demario Douglas. If I miss on him, I've got Bourne and Javon Baker late. Didn't even mention KJ Osborne. So I think it feels good during drafts, but talking to Gretch about this, it might feel better than it actually is because you need to be right in a couple of ways. Like, one, the offense has to be better than we think, but 2, you need to also like guess the receiver right. Like, we've got 5 receivers who are probably going to play a decent bit. I always prefer the rookies in these uncertain situations, but Pop Douglas in his targets per route run stuff was pretty solid last year. I know they didn't have much of a choice, but it's messy for sure. Polk is definitely the guy that seems like he has the best combination of playing time with that uncertain upside, but it's reflected in his price tag. At least in best ball, it's reflected in his price tag. Redraft, he might be completely free in most leagues, in which case he's fine as a last round pick.
Yeah, I just don't know what to do with this team. Like, Kendrick Bourne would be the guy that I try to put up. It's funny that, like, because we're talking best ball, I used this strategy last year to great effect, but the players are completely different, and it was centered around a really good quarterback. It's just a quarterback that no one wanted. It was my contention that because Cooper Kupp was being drafted so highly, people weren't really going after Rams correlations. They were just drafting Cooper Kupp and then stacking up other quarterbacks with other teams. I was like, why don't you just take Matt Stafford and the rest of the goobers on his team and not Cooper Kupp, because that's essentially free. You can draft Matt Stafford in the 16th round, draft this Puka guy, draft Van Jefferson and Tyler Higbee, and then all of a sudden you got a team. And it just turns out
Kyren Williams too.
Kyren Williams could have fallen into that as well, but I didn't take him. I took Puka instead in that. And it just turned out that Puka was the one guy that you actually needed to have, and you backdoored your way with some sort of logic, although the overall logic was wrong with it. You did get the right guy out of it.
Yeah, and that's where, when in doubt, go with the rookie, because there's just more uncertainty there. It's honestly that simple sometimes late in these drafts. if you take Kendrick Bourne and he hits,
Yeah, what do you
you know,
get?
what is that really going to do for you? You take Javon Baker, who's a downfield threat, and he hits, that might actually do something for you.
All right, that's the AFC East. You think the Bills are still going to win?
Oh yeah. No hesitation.
Just gut feeling, yes. They still got the guy. They still got the best quarterback, so that wins it for them.
I mean, they've got the best quarterback, and I think the Diggs departure is maybe I'm coping, but I think it might be not as bad for them as it might seem on paper. He didn't do much the entire second half of the season last year. I think there was a stat that like Khalil Shakir had the same counting stats on half the targets. So I think Diggs has actually wound up in like the absolute nut spot for him where he's got a really good quarterback. He can play the slot. He's got really good help and doesn't have to be just on him. So I think he's going to have a very good year. But I also think that can be true and simultaneously the Bills offense not lose too much.
All right, that will do it on the Pat Mayo Experience. Mike Leone, you got a ton of stuff on the go. Remember the days when I could call you up and be like, Mike, what are you doing? You're like, nothing. I can be on a show. Now you got tons of stuff on the go.
I know it's busy over at Establish the Run. We got so much going on. We got a best ball package. We're getting ready for redraft season, doing a bunch of stuff in preparation for the DFS season as well. It's crazy. I do less sports and I'm like just as busy as before because football is so maniacal at this point. But I love it. So yeah, check out all my stuff at Establish the Run, and the off-season projections series podcast that I mentioned is Establish the Edge. You can find that on YouTube or anywhere where you listen to your podcasts.
That will do it for me. I'm at the PME. Use runthesims.com completely free, just with an email address if you want the prop sniper or DFS tools or the simulation tools. Use code Mayo and get a discount. But if it's just the customizable projections, those are free for you to use. Go to runthesims.com right now. If you want to get in on some of this best ball, try to win millions of dollars, use code Mayo at Underdog Fantasy right now and get yourself a deposit bonus of up to $250. If you want to watch the rest of the division previews, hit the description. They're all up there. They're also on YouTube at Mayo Media Network. They're also on the Pat Mayo Experience audio podcast. Sub to them all if you like the show and help us out, all right? I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!